Okay, so welcome to the third Global Language-Based Area Studies talk this semester. We're very lucky to have with us two second-year PhD students, Andrew Mooney, who's going to talk first, and Lauren Constance, who is going to talk second, or Constance, probably I should say. And I see that there are a number of supervisors, but also others present. So as we all know, this is a constructive forum where we are looking for feedback on PhDs which are underway. In terms of the events coming up in the second semester, I'll just flag up basically that Joey will be hosting something. There will also be an event on the French presidential elections, and hopefully a big PhD-led conference as well. And without further ado, because we're keeping to 1 hour, I'd like to move straight to Andrew Mooney, who's going to talk about Ypres, a transnational commemorative space. And I'll just over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. There we go. So, hello, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Andrew, and my research focuses on British tourist experiences in Ypres, Belgium. I was actually lucky enough to visit Ypres last week and meet members of the commemorative community, as well as getting a taste of the atmosphere of the town. So, this is what I would like to achieve in the next 10 minutes or so. I'll first give a brief introduction to the town, its location, its historical significance. Then I'll move on to present the town as it is today and the atmosphere of commemoration that is promoted. Next, I will very briefly explain the concept of transnational memory and its origins, but more importantly, I will look at how it can be applied in Ypres. I will highlight the tensions between this growing movement and established memorial practices. However, as will be shown later, there is a lot of room for productive analysis of transnational memory in Ypres when it is applied correctly. So firstly, a bit of background about the town. It's a relatively small town, only about 35,000 inhabitants, located in the western Belgium, very close to the French border, as you can see. In 1914, a salient was formed around Ypres, or Ypres, as the British troops effectively referred to it, extending into the German line during the race to the sea in September and October. The salient would continue to be an important point of contestation between the Allied and the Central Powers throughout the war, and was host to ferocious fighting and a number of famous and infamous moments. It was here that the poisonous chlorine gas was first deployed by the Imperial German Army in 1915, which was met with initial success, as you can see by the kind of dashed area in the image, but countermeasures were quickly adopted. One of the most famous and controversial battles of the war was also fought here, the Battle of Passchendaele, otherwise known as the Third Battle of Ypres, which took place in 1917. By the end of the war, the city lay in ruins. In Britain, there are a number of suggestions of how to mark the town as holy ground that included preserving the town in its ruined state. This view was championed most notably by King George V and Winston Churchill, who wished for the British government to purchase Ypres as it stood to stand as a monument, with Churchill being quoted to say that a more sacred place for the British race does not exist in the world. Nowadays, the small town is reliant on tourism for much of its enterprise. The town centre is full of hotels, casual restaurants, and bakeries. However, the centre, the main square of Ypres, is dominated by two magnificent structures, which, whilst they are close in proximity, they often provide different messages. First, located in the medieval cloth hall, is the In Flanders Field Museum, taking its name from the famous poem by John McCrae. The museum looks to move away from antagonistic representations of the past, and one of the main ways they do this is by focusing on individual stories. The museum is not run by the Belgian government, and I was fortunate enough last week, whilst I was in Ypres, to speak to the researchers at the museum who are responsible for the current exhibition. They spoke about their aims for the museum and what they were trying to achieve. And their work is a good example, I feel, of transnational agents at work in a wider commemorative sphere, as they were bringing together histories from nations, personal histories, local histories, and presenting them in a connected way. Secondly, the Menin Gate, which stands on the other side of the square. This iconic war memorial to missing soldiers and those buried without a grave was constructed in 1927 by the then Imperial War Graves Commission and is home to the famous last post ceremony, which occurs every evening at 8 p.m. Arches are classically triumphalist structures, but this memorial is in no way a celebration. It represents traditional British sentiment towards the First World War. However, the names inscribed on the inside are not just British. There's representation from many Commonwealth countries. Additionally, the local area around Ypres, kind of the whole salient, is dominated by other Commonwealth War Graves Commission memorials and cemeteries, reconstructions and exhibitions, and importantly, other national sites belonging to other countries. For example, Langemark, the famous German cemetery. And as such, British tourists arriving and visiting in Ypres experience a variety of approaches to remembrance. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission isn't the presence of a monolith as it sometimes can be. There's a variety of experiences that are both nationally and independently driven. There are facets of local memories, national memories, transnational memories in quite a unique concentration. So I want to talk a bit about transnational memory here. So conventional understandings of public remembrance during the 20th century have been contained within boundaries of local communities or the nation state. With the coming of the third phase of memory studies, as named by Astudiaethau, analysis of commemoration and remembrance is now unbounded and has become flexible and fluid. It's roughly since the turn of the millennium that global memory studies and transnational memory has become a new convergence in the field. This move incorporates scholarship that is focused on mnemonic processes that unfold across and beyond national borders and cultures. This is a step beyond the methodological nationalism that has been so pervasive in the field, which is kind of best exemplified by Pierre Nora's famous Lu de Mémoire. This is further emphasized by the shift away from a focus on locations or sites of memory to notions of movement and mobility in memory. Alida Asman suggests that the term has, with continued use, moved beyond its use as a descriptive tool, but has become a prescriptive term. She claims that the success of the term is reliant on the inherent value dimension that endows it with a new perspective and vision. This has grown from the idea of cosmopolitanism and the development of Ulrich Beck's theory of cosmopolitanism in Europe. He's a very famous sociologist. His ideas are foundational for the conception of transnational memory. He popularized the term methodological nationalism. He suggests that national outlooks often prescribe the limits of sociology. However, an important point of his that I'd like to raise is that cosmopolitanism does not negate the idea of the national. Rather, particular national attachments are potential mediators between the individual and the global horizons along which identifications unfold. This concept is important to transnational memory, especially at a place like Ypres, which I will go on to explain. Pardon me. To many tourists, these national locations, such as Essex Farm Cemetery, pictured here in near Ypres, are the very fabric of material commemoration. And by that, I mean that a physical focal point is often very useful for the negotiation and articulation of thoughts, feelings, and importantly, memories. And as such, it is important not to move beyond them in our course of study. These locations and memorials are why people choose to visit Ypres. They set it apart as the unique commemorative space that it is. There has been an abundance of literature examining these interactions and stating why they're important and the importance of the landscape in which they sit. It is important, I feel, with the forward movement of the transnational in memory studies, to not forget the role of sites like this and what they do in the remembrance process. Scholars in the field have also defined this importance. Jenny Wustenberg stated that transnational memory spaces are certainly grounded in concrete locations, but they are made meaningful through cross-border linkage and through the practices of transnational agents. She makes an important distinction, stating that we use the term transnational not to discount the national or other levels of analysis, but to stress the tensions and potentials for productivity between them. And in my view, it is exactly these tensions and this crossover that makes Ypres such an exciting case. So sites of memory, I think, are key to the tourist experience in Ypres. They are both symbolic and traditional. British tourists travel abroad to sacred or holy ground, as termed earlier, and here they interact with locals, they interact with tourists from around the world, as well as tour guides that they might be with, who are both local tour guides and British tour guides. Or you could, in other words, you could say they visit concrete grounded locations that represent the national memories with which they are familiar. So the Meningate Memorial Cemetery is a good example of this. Whilst these experiences are being infused with additional meaning by the cross-border linkages, and by that I mean in terms they've traveled to a different country in the first place, and the other people that they're with, and with the actions of transnational agents that are guiding them. So whether that's speaking to someone in a museum or a tour guide or things like that. This does not negate the past. It does not negate the meaning of what they see in their national memorials. It does not negate British memory culture. But as Assmann aptly states, what it does do is it fosters for a rethinking of the national in the light of newly invented spatial and temporal coordinates. And as these tourists travel back to the UK, their memories travel with them. So, just to conclude, Ypres is a town that is central in British memory culture of the First World War. It was host to a number of key moments throughout the war, both militarily, but perhaps more importantly, psychologically, especially with the introduction of gas attacks to the battlefield. It was seen as an icon of Allied resistance, and as such was considered by many as holy ground. Today, Ypres has a variety of memorial sites and commemorative efforts, such as the work of the War Graves Commission, which presents a more traditional view of British remembrance, as well as other major sites that are important in the wider atmosphere, such as the In Flanders Field Museum. This variety means that some sites, some spaces lean into the transnational aspect of memory more than others. However, it is vital not to dismiss the importance of national remembrance sites and the nuanced transnational interactions that are taking place at these traditionally national sites of memory, because they are just as important to the wider tourist experience in transnational terms as the more obvious transnational arenas. And I think this variation in experiences is key and must be considered when looking at the tourist experience as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew, for a fascinating talk there. I should have mentioned that Andrew is funded by the ESRC, and also that Lauren, who we're going to come on to, is funded by the Sasakawa Foundation. And Lauren, your talk is entitled Eyewitness Testimonies in Japanese Memorial Museums. And I'll hand over to you. Good luck with sharing your screen.
Thank you. Okay, here we go. That's not the first slide. Right, that's my dog. Is that working? Fabulous. So, yeah, my name's Lauren, and I'm looking at eyewitness testimony in Japanese memorial museums. And I'd really like to have a sort of set of clear research questions and a very specific focus, but unfortunately all I have at the moment is a bit of a research puzzle. And that started when I did my undergraduate dissertation, which looked at the role of video testimony in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. And that research revealed that perhaps more could be done to highlight the voices of individual victims or hibakusha within the museum's narrative. And after I finished that dissertation, I went to Hiroshima for myself, and I managed to see it after it had been renovated, and was looking forward to see how maybe things had changed in the renovations. But when I looked for the video testimony, I was greeted with this scene, as you can see on the slide, hopefully. And on the left, you can see that the rest of the exhibits are sort of in this dark, dimly lit atmosphere, which invokes sort of a somber atmosphere and encourages reflection. But where the video testimony is located is sort of brightly lit, and it feels very disjointed with the rest of the exhibits. And even the route sort of directs you away from the testimony, because the testimony is kept right the way at the very back, past the little tables and also past the toilets. So if you weren't looking for them, you would miss them. So my sort of, what I'd like to investigate is why the eyewitness testimony is kept in this way, displayed in this way, and does this apply to other museums in Japan as well? So my first step in sort of trying to figure out this puzzle was doing a big literature review, and the point of this was to say, okay, is this something actually worth looking at? Have I got something here? And also, is there a framework maybe for how eyewitness testimony is displayed in memorial museums? So I did reading in 5 key areas, which was memory practice, memorialisation practice, tourism, particularly dark tourism, the memorial museum, how it functions as an institution, the use of digital technology in the museum, and also visitor feedback and visitor behaviour at museums. And I looked at this from a perspective of the outside of the Japanese context, to see what sort of more the general theories that were going on. And I found that a couple of things. Firstly, from the first 2 books, The Witness's Object and The Politics of Display, the layout or the structure of the exhibit is just a really key aspect. It talks about the fact that there are sort of political meanings behind the way that curators shape exhibits, and they want you to feel a certain way, and which made me think, is there perhaps a political decision as to why these testimonies are effectively hidden in plain sight? And then I looked at, there's a theory called global memory culture, and it says that memorial museums around the world are sort of shaped by how the Holocaust has been commemorated, and this has expanded to different regions. And it says that there's a focus on the individual. However, this hasn't really helped me to figure out why eyewitness testimony is displayed in this way in Japan, because I didn't really get that sense of the focus on the individual in the Hiroshima Museum. And I also looked at digitalization, and Jeffrey Hartman, who did a lot of work on Holocaust testimony and archives, said that the digital guarantees reception, but it doesn't guarantee receptiveness. So even though there's archives and hours of, testimony, it doesn't actually mean that people will go and click on those archives and watch those videos. So it's important to find a way to get visitors to engage with this. And it's been shown that audio, visual and interactive exhibits are a good way of engaging visitors in this, with this sort of content and the human narrative. I also came away from the literature review with questions and things that I thought were perhaps missing. So firstly, that the theory of global memory culture was heavily focused on case studies of events from Europe and North America and didn't really mention Japan. And I think this speaks to the research team, the Global Language-Based Area Studies research team, in that when Japan was mentioned, it didn't rely on a lot of Japanese language scholarship. So that's something I'm hoping to do in my research, is to consult the Japanese language scholarship to see how that translates. So because it's not showing Japan in global memory culture, we don't see how or whether Japan fits into this theory. And if it doesn't, perhaps what can we learn from Japan in the way that it's displaying testimony in its exhibits? The other thing that I thought might be missing was the ethical implications. So there was a lot in the literature review that focused on the impact of the exhibits on the visitors or the people who don't have the direct memory of the events. However, I felt like there was less on the people who are being commemorated themselves. What are the impacts of these digital technologies, and how do they feel about the way that they are being represented in museums? And there's this Holocaust, it's like a virtual survivor program where they record things, the testimony, and put it into like an AI hologram situation. And I think we need to see how far we're going to take this technology beyond the point where Holocaust survivors can't give their opinion on how it should be used. So I think those are sort of important questions I need to think about. So armed with this sort of knowledge from the literature review and these questions, what I'm currently working on at the moment is gathering as much information as I can on a list of Japanese memorial museums I've created. So far, I've looked at 15 different museums spread from Fukushima in the north all the way to Okinawa in the south. And I'm looking at questions like, what is the museum's history? How did it start? Who opened it up? Who is it run by now? How long did it take for the museum to open after the event had ended? Is it part of any associations? Just getting as much as I can. And the museums commemorate different events. So not only war, but things like environmental pollution, nuclear disaster, things like that. Already from these 15 museums, a couple of themes are emerging as to how Japanese memorial museums exhibit eyewitness testimony. So there's the sort of original display, which is the survivor speaks directly about their experiences to a group or a sort of lecture format. But as these survivors are slowly passing away, especially for the events further back in history, the museums are looking to new different methods of being able to communicate these stories to visitors. So firstly, on the right here, we've got the museum which commemorates the 1995 Kobe earthquake. And this is similar to Hiroshima in that it's sort of called a testimony corner, and it's a booth where you can sit separate to the rest of the exhibition contents and watch testimony on demand. And you can normally search for this yourself. Then we have here, this is the Women's Active Museum on War and Peace, which commemorates women who, commonly known as comfort women, who were subjected to sexual violence during Japan's colonial expansion. And as they are not government funded, because the government sort of deny that this took place, they don't really have the funds for digitalization, so they rely on textual panels to tell the stories of the individual women. And I think funding and where this funding comes from is going to maybe play a key part into why testimony is displayed in certain ways. And then we also have on the right, this is the Avon Legacy Successor Programme, or sort of like storyteller program. And this is where a storyteller or a volunteer will learn the testimony of a Hiroshima survivor, and they will tell that story on the behalf of the survivor when they can no longer do so in person. This volunteer will normally get 2 or 3 years of training to sit down and learn the story. And they also learn techniques onto how to use digital media, presentations, and storytelling techniques. But I think because it's not the survivor speaking, there's also a lot of ethical questions here about this mode of display, which I've not seen used in any of the non-Japanese museums. So my next step would then be to go and do a research trip to Japan so I can interview curators and see the exhibits for myself. But unfortunately, there's an ever so slight obstacle at that to the moment, as the border is totally closed. However, this hasn't been the only impact of COVID-19 on my research, and it's actually led me to question my original research questions. And this is because one of the challenging aspects of this research is that it's constantly evolving. Maybe it's due to the aging of the victims, but a lot of the museums have said that they've been pushed by COVID-19 to move their exhibits online. And they've done this in a few ways. So the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum has set up a YouTube channel where you can watch testimonies of different lengths, and you can watch them with English subtitles as well. Then the Women's Active Museum and the Turan Peace Museum have set up online museums. So they're YouTube videos where they're narrated by a curator taking you through the exhibits, but it's not an interactive feature. Then the Daigo Fukuru Maru, which is like the Bikini Atoll incident with the Lucky Dragon fishing boat that was affected by a nuclear test. They've chosen to promote a documentary which features eyewitness testimony on their website, but it's not something that the museum has developed themselves. And then the last two, the Yokkaichi Pollution Environmental Feature Museum and again the Kobe Earthquake Museum, which have 3D interactive tours which are available on their website. The only thing with these sort of interactive tours is that you can't actually watch the testimony. So you can click to see the exhibits, but when you get to the booths or the testimony corners, you can't interactively watch the testimony from there. So that's another sort of challenge to these modes of display. So where does this leave me in the sort of research puzzle? It's made me question really, what is a memorial museum? Is the important thing the sort of bricks and mortar of the museum itself, or is the museum anywhere where these victims or individuals can be commemorated and remembered? And in the context of COVID-19, is it important to bring visitors to this place, or is it now perhaps the responsibility of museums to reach out to people and connect digitally? That's where I am, and I'd really appreciate any feedback on these ideas or where I can take it from here. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, that's brilliant. If you could stop sharing, actually, that's perfect. Thanks, Lauren. Thank you for a brilliant talk. Now, I know, see, hands are up here. I don't know whose hand went up first, actually. I saw Joseph, you had your hand up when there's so many hands up, it's almost impossible. So should we say Joseph, then Victoria, then I think Geraldine, then Liz? Should we do it like that?
Sorry, I was just applauding for the presentation.
Oh, just applauding, sorry. Was that applause as well from you, Victoria, or was that, it was just applause? Okay, so we don't have quite so many questions. I thought we had a few more. Who would like to ask a question on this front? From the supervisors? No? Oh, yes, Liz, okay.
I was just clapping, but I do have a question as well. It's a question to Lauren, really interesting. And I was looking at first, and I thought, especially, I guess, because Chris is your supervisor, I was thinking, is that an airport that it was the picture of, where it was that big open space? And I thought, it's Chris somehow managed to bring those different elements in together. But that bit that you finished with on the end, where you're talking about how COVID has moved things online. And I was wondering how that would, if there's an area to think about there in terms of your previous question about how funding is driving the extent to which people can go digitally. So if you're saying that, you know, the exhibition for the Comfort Women was not as well funded, so didn't have the resources to go digitally. I was just wondering if there's something to look at there in terms of the speed with which institutions have been able to respond to COVID, and as you said, that need to reach out, and then the kind of the quality of the experience. So maybe that would be a different angle of looking at how COVID has impacted it, and the way in which they've in different institutions and the different issues being memorialised have been able to respond.
Lauren?
Yeah, definitely. I think in some respects it's too soon to tell how much COVID-19 is impacting the way these museums are displaying, but there is that, and also the fact that museum said the more we put online, because we rely so heavily on donations, fewer people will actually visit the museum and increase the funding. So it's sort of like a vicious cycle in a way. Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely something to look at. But
great paper, well done. It was well, both of you, great papers. I really enjoyed it. Learned a lot from both of you, and very well presented. So many congratulations, both.
Thank you.
I agree entirely. Who else would like to come in with a question? David, I see a hand is up.
I think Chris was before me.
Oh, sorry, Chris. Yes, Chris, carry on.
I'll say age before beauty, but okay, I'll go first then. Brilliant papers, well done, both of you. I've got a really cheeky question for you, Andrew, to put you really on the spot. Based on what you've just heard from Lauren's presentation, do you feel that there's anything from what Lauren's doing that raises questions for your own research, given that Lauren was pointing that from her literature review, was pointing to the sort of how Japan tends to get overlooked, it seems.
Yeah, no, very much.
I was actually Lauren even got this wrong.
No, I was actually, it made me think of, I was trying to think of a question to ask Lauren, because I was thinking about what she said in terms of, there's termed a global memory culture, but Japan didn't seem to fit into that narrative. And I was thinking to myself, would that be more aptly termed a Western memory culture? As Lauren said about Europe and North America, and I was thinking to myself, most of the literature you come across is obviously written in those places, and it uses examples from those places, and that's been changing a bit more. But yeah, I think what Lauren was talking about with the global memory culture, I think, at least in my experience, I mean, I am working in the West, which I found quite helpful, but I think that a Western memory culture would probably be more apt.
Thanks for that, Andrew. David, I think it's over to you.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right about that, Andrew. And I remember from years ago, teaching memory studies modules at postgraduate level, where half the people were in the room were Chinese, and when you start talking about Holocaust memory as a global memory, there's a kind of look of bafflement, because it's a kind of a projection, isn't it, on the part of certain Western commentators. So I think what you're doing there, Lauren, is really interesting in terms of thinking about how some of those Western models not only interact with Japanese context, but also thinking about kind of scholarship coming out of the Japanese context and how that might inform the debate. I think that's a really, really good thing to be doing. Just a couple of comments about the stuff about the digitization. I think that's really important. You might think about looking at some of the literature on digital remediation and memory, because that's grappling with some of the same issues that you are, I think. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. I've been working on sort of online museums and archives, and I think there's maybe something to be said there about the museum is not necessarily something that's made out of bricks and mortar. It's a cultural institution, and it lends a certain importance or significance to whatever events you're talking about. Yes, that's why quite often groups who've been neglected or sidelined or whatever, an aim is quite often we want a museum, because if we have a museum, it sort of says that we're an important part of history, So I think it's interesting to think about how that doesn't have to any longer necessarily be just something that's happening in a physical space, that could be in a digital space as well. There's quite a few examples of that developing, I think. But anyway, to a question. finally gets to a question. I was just thinking about your testimonies, and what quite often seems to be going on there is that testimony is being fixed in place. Even in your example, which I think, yes, in the Western context would be seen as very odd, the idea of somebody else learning to perform another's testimony, because, you know, you're supposed to be in there in the room with the person reliving the emotions, aren't you? How can that be if it's a different person? But sort of what we know about witnesses and their testimony is that actually it changes. That we have this notion that there is an authenticity to listening to the person who experienced the event, but actually that testimony isn't really authentic in the sense of this is a direct experience of what it was really like. We know from the research on the way that people witness over their lives, that how they view the events, how they contextualize them, even the details, the way they emphasize certain things, it changes. But you're kind of turning these into exhibits. It does sort of fix them once and for all, doesn't it? And say, this is now the testimony, in the same way that those kind of Holocaust video archives do. So that was my sort of question, was what is the purpose of this kind of fixing? Is it just because you need something to put in a museum, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, thank you for the information on digital remediation. I will definitely look into that. Yeah, that's not something I'd actually thought about, because you're right, it is something that adapts, and that's an important part of the memory, is that memory is constantly changing. And I think, yeah, that's a good question, honestly. Yeah.
I would say I don't have an answer either. I'm just kind of throwing that curveball there.
Yeah, it's. Yeah, I think that's maybe where the sort of that the storytelling comes into it, that the successors program, because they have the ability to change the stories. And I read about that, how there was a particular story that one survivor didn't include in their testimony, but they told it to this volunteer storyteller, and they said, oh, that's really interesting, I'm going to put that in what I tell to people. So in that's a way of sort of making sure that these testimonies do evolve rather than being static or fixed.
Excellent. Any questions? I mean, I can ask a question. Maybe this is not my topic, but linked to what David was saying, I'm always curious as to what kind of verification process goes on when somebody says that they've got an eyewitness testimony. And similarly with these transnational agents that you mentioned, Andrew, you know, people, as David said, remember things and they misremember things, and so on. And how, so I suppose the memory is evolving. Yes, I get that, but is it evolving in an inaccurate fashion, and what can be done to ensure that that isn't the case? And then just one other kind of point to you, Lauren, actually, I'm not sure whether you're looking at these eyewitnesses across all memorial museums in Japan, or whether you're going to drill down and look at a smaller number. And if so, you might have to consider what kind of event that they are commemorating and how comparable those events are. So obviously Hiroshima, it's quite difficult to find something to compare that with, but at the same time, there might be, you know, you could have most of the similar cases, or you could have a range of cases, because what would you be expecting to find, and funding will be different as well. So that's more of a comment, the latter point, but so I'll leave that open to you guys from a completely non-expert perspective.
I guess I'll go first. I think, so as I said, I was in Ypres last week and I spoke to I spoke to 3 tour guides, 1 Belgian and 2 British who have emigrated and live there to give tours. And I heard 3 completely different stories about why they're there, 3 completely different reasonings about what they thought was important. And it was all based around the First World War, and it was all based around sharing the story, but they had very different attitudes. And I think in some arenas, as you said, it can be important to kind of promote the right story, especially in a museum, and tour guides do their best to give the right information. But I think that education and memory are very different. And I think their memories or their ideas, I think it's important to have those different things, because I think that's as important to the tourist experience as getting the right, the quote unquote right story. And because you don't just speak to one person whilst you're there, that may be the most important person, but you speak to multiple people, and you speak to your partner that you're with about what you think about what they said, and so on and so on. So I think there are lots of diverging memories, but I think that's important, and I think it promotes discussion, and I think it's all part of the process. And I think it's a process that's been going on for so long that we barely really even understand. But I think that divergence in transnational agents is important. Thank you.
Lauren?
Okay. Gordon, if I may ask a question myself.
Yes, certainly do. Please do.
Oh, sorry, Lauren,
No,
did you want to comment on that as well? No. Okay, sorry. No, I just wanted to ask Andrew, well, it's more like a comment, but just because I think I need a little bit of clarification with this topic. I'm not too familiar with your subject, so excuse me if I misunderstood. But when you speak of traditional, you equate that to the national memorialisation or national sites. And then when you speak of transnational, it isn't clear to me what makes a memorial transnational. Because if I'm thinking of what you said about the British effort to keep the site and memorialize that, even though it's in a different country, that to me makes it inherently a transnational experience, because there's 2 countries involved. So is it more the approach that we have now that is transnational towards these memory sites?
Yeah, I think maybe I didn't articulate it as well as I could, but I think when I say traditional memory, I more meant traditional memory culture. So the way that British people have traditionally viewed something, rather than saying this is a traditional memorial and this is a transnational thing. I think, as you were saying, I think it's the human interaction at somewhere that makes it transnational. I don't think a stone can be transnational. I think you need actors, as a kind of transnational actors I was saying, or I think people make it transnational. And you're right. I think one of the big parts about Ypres as a transnational space is the fact that it's not on UK soil. And there's an idea of called extraterritorial heritage that is in my literature review. I didn't have time to go into it here, but it kind of goes in that idea of what if something that is seen as inherently British, so Ypres as a space kind of has been since the First World War, or more specifically the memorials, it's seen as inherently British, but it's on foreign soil. And I think that's where there's a blend of these memorials that represent something traditional and seen as national with international or transnational experiences.
Thank you, Andrew.
Can I just add to that? I mean, and you mentioned that there's also a German memorial in the same city. So I'm guessing that people who go to Ypres from Britain have certain expectations before they go. They're going there for a purpose. Now, do those same people go to the German cemetery as well? Because then we're really adding another layer, which would actually challenge some of those presuppositions that they may have before going, and give them a really even more transnational experience. I'm just wondering. Yeah,
it's a great point. Before before I went myself, I always thought that when you speak to people about their experiences and places like that, they always say that they come away feeling much more affected than they thought they would. And it changed their view. And when I spoke to the tour guides whilst I was there, they said a similar thing. Generally, people are quite touched and people feel quite a strong emotional connection. And I asked all of them, actually. I asked them the same question. I said, have you ever had any adverse reactions in Langemarck? Because they all included it in their tours. And 2 of them said they'd only ever had one. And the third said that they'd never had any problems. So I think it is an important aspect of the transnational, and especially being on the other side, because it can attempt to take away from the antagonistic relationship. But yeah, I think it's a very important step in that journey, and it's included in pretty much every tour that's offered. So I think the local community sees it the same way.
That's fascinating. Now, who else we've got quite a few supervisors here. We've got research, visiting research. Oh, David, question? Yes, comment.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think you're dead right, Andrew. That the transnational is a key term here. What I would probably say we might want to think about is whether we're going to use the term transnational in a kind of periodizing way, which you seem to be doing at the moment, or whether we're thinking about the transnational as something which has always been there, but might be expressing itself in different modes, if you like, for want of a better term, at different times. So you mentioned the last post at Ypres, the Menin Gate. Yes, it's a Commonwealth War Graves Memorial site. It's kind of a piece of extraterritorial heritage. But the last post association is a Belgium association and always has been from 1928. So, there's First World War tourism, which has been going on almost as soon as the guns stopped firing. There was tourism to the Western Front. I mean, literally, as they were still clearing battlefields, people were out there looking for the place where, relatives had fallen. And that was facilitated by a local tourist industry. It sprung up to meet that need. So, yeah, I think I would maybe not say there's like a traditional national remembrance with national forms, and then there's a kind of, today we have a transnational remembrance. I would say maybe the transnational has always kind of maybe been in the mix, and we need to think about how it's evolved.
Yeah, I think when I see what you mean, and I think that maybe the transnational has just come to be recognized. And when I say the traditional memory culture, I guess I'm thinking an average British tourist, when they go, that's what they're going to be thinking before they go. And although, like, historically, if what I claim that these interactions in a country with people from that country are making something transnational, then clearly there would have been some element of transnationality ever since people have been going. But I think actually tourists probably still aren't recognizing that when they're not stood there thinking, wow, this is a great transnational experience. I'm experiencing different countries. They would then go home and then think about it slightly differently. So I think, I may have oversimplified it in that terms, but I think it's more about people's thought process than the actual act of commemoration on the ground.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And I see there's Victoria and then Roussel. I'm not sure whether Elena as well, but Victoria, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Can everyone hear me? So
yes,
my internet
yes.
connection is a bit funny today. Thank you.
That's okay.
Really, really interesting, both papers. Thank you so much to both speakers. I was just interested, I guess, one of the kind of concepts that's sort of been floating around my mind listening to both of these presentations to some extent is nostalgia, and that perhaps kind of links to some of the comments that have been made and questions that have been made. And I just wondered to what extent your kind of those concepts are striking you as relevant to your projects, both of you, or not, as they might not be, but just some of the things that you said kind of have made me sort of wonder about how some of the interactions and some of the ways in which there is curation of certain materials, and it might not be a nostalgia for a very long ago time, but I mean, for Lauren, is there a kind of nostalgia for the space of the museum, as it were, the physicality of it? And Andrew, is something about nostalgia and how that then kind of frames the tourist experience that then lends itself to these kind of understandings of transnational or national kind of interaction with the space? I don't know if that's very clear, sorry, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on nostalgia.
Excellent, thank you for that, Victoria. Who wants to go first? Andrew?
Okay. I think nostalgia for the First World War is connected very much to family, and people see family as quite a personal connection, and they look back on what their family has done and things like that. So I think for the First World War, I think it's becoming less and less, especially with generation of researchers, including myself. Like I don't know of any family connection I might have had, but I think it's more of a factor in the literature, and that's due to the age of people who are writing that literature, because generally it's going to be older, later career researchers who are more connected to their family that might be closer to that point. So I think nostalgia is kind of phasing out a bit as we move away and as the family connections kind of dissipate.
Thanks, Andrew. Lauren?
Yeah, I think there's less nostalgia in terms of the events that are being memorialized, as some of them are quite traumatic, but you're right, it's like the nostalgia for the museum space. Like many Japanese school children will go to Hiroshima or Nagasaki on school trips, and meeting a survivor or hearing their testimony is a really sort of focal part of that trip. And so being able to then go back to the museum space and still have that experience, I think, is an important part of the museum trying to still include the testimony or the sort of aspect of being spoken to by a direct sort of survivor of the attacks. So yeah, I think nostalgia does play a role.
That's excellent. Roussel, you've got a question?
Yes, thank you both for your talks. Really interesting. Some comments after the talks kind of made me reflect on the role of eyewitness testimony. So this is actually more for Lauren. David spoke about eyewitness testimony not being fixed in time and something that perhaps evolves. And Gordon mentioned, about accuracy and truthfulness. And one of the museums that you're looking at looks at comfort women, and so-called comfort women, I should say, which is, of course, a hugely controversial and contested issue in Japan. And one of the points that's used to attack it is that that's all you have, is that oral history, that eyewitness testimony by the women themselves. And it started to make me wonder about whether the role of eyewitness testimony in a place such as that functions very differently from, say, in Hiroshima, where you have so much documentary evidence about it. So yeah, maybe it's less a question and more me musing about some things that came up. But yeah, I'm just thinking there's probably a very different role for eyewitness testimony depending on who and what is being commemorated.
Lauren, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that goes back to what I was looking at in the sort of museum's origins, and if they started off as a response to an event with a collection of artifacts like Hiroshima, then the testimony is sort of it almost seems supplementary to the original artifacts and the relics, whereas things that don't have that physical evidence, I think that's where the role of the eyewitness testimony becomes more key, because that is the sort of, and yeah, the importance of the authenticity of that and getting those stories right is perhaps more important than in Hiroshima, which is where it's used as for a sort of emotional effect rather than proving that the event happened. So yeah, definitely something to look at.
That's really good. And Elena, you've been very patient. You had your hand up earlier. Do you want to ask a question? Oh, we don't hear it. We're not hearing you actually.
Following Russell, because I was thinking something similar with Hiroshima Museum having so many little objects that catch people's attentions, and they just have, some of them, well, many of them don't have any information about the person because they don't know who they belong to, but there are some personal objects that have small snippets of personal stories and individual stories. And I was wondering if you have explored anything, Lauren, about the connection between display of that sort of object linked to witness testimony, and how efficient it can be to have more of a, I don't know, something physical rather than just a poster or a display of the story.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there's a couple of points on that, in that the artifacts, they've changed in the renovation, they changed the exhibits to make more of a sort of personal human connection with them. So instead of just having a sort of description of what the object is, for example, charred lunchbox, they've got a story. So whoever it was, the young child took this lunchbox to school, he was really looking forward to eating it, but he never got to eat it. And that sort of combination of the story, even though it's not testimony, but the individual narrative alongside that artifact, I think has a more of an impact than just seeing the object. And I think that's important, because if you just have these objects, it sort of and especially with photos as well, you don't see these things as sort of, they're only impacted by the atomic bomb rather than them having a life before that. And that's where I think the voices of the Hibakusha is really important to include, because they're not only victims of the atomic bombing, they are human beings in their own right, and I think they deserve to be seen like that. So anything that can humanize that, I think, is a good idea.
Thank you for that. We've got about 1 minute left, so we've got time for one question or one comment. I've only got a semi-comment which I can do in 10 seconds, which is that the Hiroshima thing, it makes me think somehow bizarrely of Pompeii. Pompeii was wiped out, but they were easily able to reconstruct it by, it actually preserved everything underneath it. But Hiroshima was the opposite of that, wasn't it? It's unlike any kind of war where you've got the unknown soldiers. Everybody's been wiped out, and others. I mean, the other aspect of it as well, what about people who've got radiation and so on from that bomb, and what is their testimony? So, I mean, I do think it's fascinating. I don't know, does anybody have a concluding comment or question? We've got 38 seconds left. No? Well, it just remains for me to thank the speakers. There won't be a post-webinar questionnaire. I think the questions have been great. The fact that we've done it in Zoom has actually been a lot more friendly, actually, for smaller groups. And this is, in week 11, you've done extremely well to get this turnout, because we are incredibly busy, and great talks. Thank you so much to both of you, and good luck in the years ahead, So thank you very much to everybody for turning up in week 11 as well. Much appreciated. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you for listening as well,
yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
No, that's great.